We've now reached module 6 in our tutorial of GST. In this module, we are going to check up returns. So far, we've seen why GST is a big deal. We've checked out the composition scheme, input tax credit, registration process, time, place, and value of supply. It's now time to check up returns that a taxpayer has to file under GST. Here's a laundry list of the things that we'll check out in this module of returns. Who should file returns? Who are the taxpayers who are supposed to file return, and why exactly is it required that a return be filed? This particular topic would apply for all taxpayers to check out which return they are supposed to file. After that, we'll get into the details of each and every return, and that if you're a taxpayer trying to find out what return you're going to file, then first refer to the who should file return part, where we'll talk about which return applies to which taxpayer. Once you know which return applies to you, then go to the video pertaining to those returns. Each of the returns have timelines, and there are overall conditions attached to filing returns and post-return filing processes on part of the government. What can you expect? We'll look into all of these in this module. Let's start off with section 1, where we'll cover who should file the returns and why. After that, we'll look into the details of returns for normal registered taxpayer. You should know that filing returns is very crucial. It is important because all returns serve as the point of contact between a registered taxable person and the government. While a registered taxable person has the duty to pay tax, it's the government's duty to grant input tax credit to registered taxpayers and to check compliance of tax laws. They also have their own rights that they can exercise. A registered taxpayer, of course, has the right to claim input tax credit on his purchases, while the government has the right to collect tax on supply transaction. It works crisscross, right? The duty of a taxpayer is the right of the government. For the taxpayer to abide by his duty of paying tax and to exercise his right to claim input tax credit, he should definitely file returns. That is the importance for a registered taxpayer. The returns show the tax liability and the tax paid for a given period. They serve as proof for claiming ITC. The return of the supplier of goods and services facilitate ITC claims for recipient of these goods and services. Once you file your tax return, you have declared all details of your tax transactions, tax payments, collections, everything, input tax credit claimed. This is why returns serve as proof of tax compliance. All your tax transactions are documented and submitted to the government. That's proof of complying with tax law. The government obviously has figures of other taxpayers who have transacted with you in order to check whether you've complied correctly or not. And that is the duty of the government, to check compliance, to grant input tax credit, and the right to collect tax. And this is also facilitated by the returns. Through returns filed by all the taxpayers, the registered taxpayers in the economy, the government can track transactions in the entire country. It can check compliance by comparing two returns. It can check correctness of tax payment of input tax credit claimed. The return also helps in audit and anti-evasion measures, anti-tax evasion measures of government, and it provides inputs for government to take sound policy decisions. There is one major advantage that I want to highlight to you, which will form the basis of understanding the concept, the base principle of having these returns and how they work. That's the check correctness of tax payment or input tax credit. How does the government do that? Now, here's an overview of the entire tax flow. You have the government, the supplier, and the buyer, three parties involved in the transaction. The supplier and the buyer are registered taxpayers, of course, because unregistered payers need not file return. A transaction would include the supplier raising an invoice, actually supplying the goods or services to the buyer, and then paying tax to the government on such transaction, collecting the tax as well as the amount for his supplies from the buyer, and the buyer and the supplier filing returns to the government. This is what is involved in the tax process. And so you have, other than the government, the supplier who's collecting tax and the recipient who's paying tax to the supplier and claiming input tax credit on such tax paid on purchases. And therefore, the tax collected by supplier from the recipient must be equal to the tax paid by the supplier to the government, one leg, the supplier part, and this must be equal to the input tax credit claimed by the recipient. This is the transaction. This is the formula that is checked from the returns filed by the supplier and the buyer. The figures that are in return of supplier should match the return figures of the buyer. And that is how the government is going to check compliance of tax law, the correctness of the tax payment and input tax credit claimed. That's the duty and right of the government, and that's why returns have to be filed. Now that we've understood what returns are trying to achieve, let's now go into who is required to file these returns. Now we saw the driving factor for filing returns for a taxpayer is that he has the duty to pay tax and the right to claim input tax credit. We've gone through the provisions relating to registration in detail in Module 4, and we've seen that every person who collects tax or claims input tax credit has to be a registered taxable person, and therefore all registered taxable persons are required to file returns, mandatorily required. Even if they have no business activity, if a person is registered, then he has to file returns. He can file a nil return, a zero return, if there are no business activities. Remember, all registered taxable persons are given a GSTIN, their GST identification number, and based on this identification number, they'll have to file return. It will be quoted in all the returns that they file. There was another person apart from registered taxable person who's issued an identification number under GST. The UNO and related agencies, they are issued a unique identification number UIN, and therefore any specialized agency of UNO, any multilateral financial institution who is notified under the United Nations Act of 1947, all of them have to file return. Their returns are very simple, and for each transaction there's nothing complicated at all, and in this module we are not going to go into detail of their returns because it's a special case. All registered taxable persons will have to keep on filing returns for every month that the transaction is undertaken, or every quarter, depending on what status the taxpayer is. So regular returns will have to be filed, while for United Nations and related agencies, only based on transaction. They are one-off and we'll not be discussing them in this module. So our scope is restricted to normal registered taxable persons filing regular returns. There are different types of returns for each category of taxpayers, and we need to know which category we fall into to decide what return we have to file. So there are normal taxpayers and there are specific taxpayers. They are the two categories, broad categories. Under these, you can identify 6 types of taxpayers. The first, of course, is a normal registered taxpayer who has only normal business transactions, nothing unusual. The second is a taxpayer who's opted for the composition scheme. The third is a non-resident taxable person. Fourth, input service distributor. Fifth, any person who's deducting tax. And sixth, an e-commerce operator. These are the 6 categories, and there are different types of returns for each category. The first category of normal registered taxable person, they have 4 returns, 1, 2, 3 and 9. Composition scheme taxpayers have 2, that's 4 and 9A, and the remaining have 1 each. Before we go into the details of each of these returns, we'll check out certain conditions, certain overall conditions that a taxpayer has to abide by before he can file return and while filing return. That's what we'll discuss in the next video.